what's going on? This is a quick video sort of outlining, just from publicly available declassified CIA stuff, how the US has approached Iran. And the central theme I'm going to push across, which I think is progressive in some senses, is that the way the US used to approach Iran is almost as this mystical power vacuum and something that you could pick apart. This goes back to maybe the late 70s and early 80s, early to mid 80s. And there is almost this, like, if you're into political science, there's this phenomenon of Orientalism, where the West in hegemony typically approaches foreign nation states. The sort of narrative that's created is that they're almost these mystical non-state actors. There's something different in the water or something. And this sort of sounds like how the CIA used to approach Iran. If you look at old documents, there's an emphasis on the way that Islamic government is either used pragmatically or it's used as a way to create this almost retractive, resource-based sort of state structure. And so there's always this assumption of pragmatism, but it begins to become relevant when you start breaking down or trying to understand how Iranian institutions function, how they work. And so when you look at how they function or how they work, particular emphasis in the CIA has always been placed within the IRGC, as well as within the judiciary. Why is this? Well, when you're claiming legitimacy from theocratic rule, whatever you end up pushing out from that is reinforced by not only sort of these cults of personality, but also the perception, just sort of U.S. bullshit, but also this perception that the judiciary is acting for the Iranian people based on this ideology. So, one line that's sort of fascinating. There's two things that are fascinating. The first one is the U.S. sort of picked and choose people that they were somehow fascinated in, these personalities that they're fascinated in. And the second thing that the U.S. had done in the past is trying to discount the ideology to some extent. So you would see them talking about how ideology is either just this pragmatic tool, or as it started to become a little more transparent what the CIA wanted to do and how they wanted to say this, how they would view Iran as a nation state, they'd also argue that ideology in Iran, Islamic ideology, is a means of social control. It's a system to divvy up resources, to create social classes, and people that bought into this ended up doing better than people that didn't buy into this. And so if you fast forward to sort of, I think it's it's either the beginning or the end of sort of, just publicly available documents from sort of that Cold War period where the U.S. was concerned with how Iran would operate within the Eastern Bloc. The thing that started to merge is that we began to just sort of generally cover blanket terms for how we saw factionalism in Iran. And so one of the things, the way that we'd sort of break this up is when you're talking about, trying to understand something or whatever it is, the thing that you would just be able to do is talk about moderates, conservatives, and radical factionalism. Those were your three options if you were in the CIA in the 1970s or 80s. You're supposed to say something otherwise if that's not the case. I was just watching World War Z, and Brad Pitt there's one really interesting segment of the movie where, this guy knew some secret or something, and he said, "How'd you know? No one would have ever guessed that." And he said, "Well, I was the 10th man, If 9 out of 10 people are exploring the ordinary causes, the 10th one is the one that finds the right answer in this case. So I was just the 10th guy. I was just the guy that found this out." Anyways, the sort of, if you don't accept the sort of 10th man theory thinking about Iran, then you're basically arguing just if you strip away definitions and you were to, instead of sitting down with either members of the CIA or members of the Foreign Intelligence Committee in the Senate, you would end up uh, talking to like normal Iranian politicians and people, and they would say, well, yeah, um, the way the system works is there's some people that want to politicize Iranian resources, our position in the region. Geopolitically, we want to be more relevant. We believe there's a lot of traction, and we believe for some reason that the Iranian position necessarily needs to reach out and continue to do so. And then the other side would say, well, no, actually, what it's always been is that there's always just been this idea that the way that we work together is protectionism. It's when we talk about Islamic society and sort of developing the sort of total package of having consistency in institutions, having understandable Muslim ways to go to work and to get paid and stuff like that. And that's all the U.S. opinion is, well, that's all you have, is that, this is all about Iran. And eventually, if we look at nations like whoever it is, Saudi Arabia or someone else, will eventually be able to play into hegemony. There maybe isn't this strong of a position that as a nation state, we can afford right now to create these differences within our armed forces and political management of the state of Iran. And then finally, the middle of the road folks, I don't think the U.S., especially in the 80s, thought very much of this. They generally didn't see moderates. Well, they did. The subtext is that they saw moderates as a means of creating disruption, and between conservatives and radical factions, that's where you run your playbook. But with the middle of the road folks, it was always that, well, look, there's always going to be some representation outside of maybe mainstream Tehran, and within Tehran, there's always going to be this sort of discord, this almost gas pedal and brakes, just like we see anywhere else. And so when you're trying to push, if you're the U.S. in the Cold War and you're saying we're going to push stuff into the judiciary, we're going to try and get some of these people working as assets or whatever it is, we're going to try and get a stronger presence in the Iranian military, all of these things. Well, what you're ultimately trying to do is to sow distrust or build faith that the sort of middle position is capable of more, it's able to push itself out, and won't necessarily align itself with either the USSR, or it won't create this sort of regional power vacuum and, get Saddam on the phone or something and say, hey, start a war. Whatever it was. But the only reason I'm bringing this up is, given the conflict in Iran, I think with the West doesn't really have interests in the region right now, but I think with Ayatollah Khomeini, my own opinion is getting past this sort of hack description where we're necessarily looking at only the topological descriptions of how a state works, but also talking about how the mechanisms in a more fine-grained way support what I think a lot of people in 2024, without only sort of supporting this regional version of security policy, see as a sort of necessary call for peace, a necessary way to work together. I think that's it, I think the next level of mysticism, and this is the main point of the video, the next level of sort of Orientalism in international theory is pretending that looking at moderate or nationalistic or power-seeking, power-grabbing activities is a fundamental layer of how foreign governments interact with a comparative layer of government. That's just not going to work, I don't think. And when you ask why that's not going to work, it's because the questions are too grandiose. Everything's too grandiose if you're not talking about fundamental layers of institutionalism. And does that sound like backfooting it or something? No, it sounds like you don't know what the fuck you're talking about when you act like a fucking crazy person. You ask other people to follow you with your fucking bullshit, It's actually way fucking different than that. And when you go someplace else and you don't have a fucking question to ask, isn't that a sign of clarity? Ain't that a motherfucker? That's something if I've ever fucking seen it.